Well, let's bring in our political editor, Andrew Probyn in Canberra, and the host of RN Breakfast, Patricia Karvelas. Hello to you both. Andrew, to you, first of all. So he's not stepping down. He was trying to explain why he did what he did. What did you think of what you heard there?
Well, first of all, Ros, it was a defiant Scott Morrison. He says that what he did was legal, but ultimately not entirely convincing. Now, let's remember, let's wind back the clock. Yesterday morning, he was asked by Ben Fordham on 2GB, was he aware or did he sign, was he sworn into any other ministries other than finance, health, and one extra, resources? He couldn't recall. Now, remarkable, because one of those or two extra portfolios that he had been sworn into, administratively, he adds, were Treasury and also Home Affairs. He said today that there were good reasons for that. So he didn't remember being sworn in, but he said there were good reasons for being sworn in, because these portfolios, he said, were ones that had unilateral decision making that was not subject to Cabinet. That includes budgeting when it comes to Treasury. It includes the AUKUS agreement when it comes to the Home Affairs Department. Think there about cyber capability. He said two things that seem to contrast. He talked about the fact that he was not a co-administrator of various departments, that he didn't effectively administer a portfolio, but that he had the power to exercise should he see that as necessary. So, as I say, unconvincing. And it has a lot of questions still over this.
PK, as we heard, he tried to lay out why he took on those roles to be there in case of emergency, as Andrew's described there. But there was no real clear explanation as to why he didn't discuss what he was doing with the Cabinet.
Well, he did seek to explain. Andrew is dead right. Just yesterday, I thought it was extraordinarily inconsistent and wouldn't survive a court case, can I say, because just yesterday he couldn't recall being sworn in as administratively, as he says today, but as Treasurer or Home Affairs Minister. These are really big departments, powerful roles. And today he could explain in actual detail the thinking behind why he didn't tell those ministers, Josh Frydenberg and Karen Andrews. And what he said was that he didn't want it to be misconstrued or misunderstood. So he did make an active decision not to tell them that he was actually the minister that was. He says, you know, he tries to seek to say that he wasn't playing a role as a minister in those roles, but he was actually sworn in as minister because he didn't want it to be misinterpreted. Now, I think that raises more questions than answers in many ways. It is actually an extraordinary statement to make, Ros, to suggest that if he had told, for instance, Josh Frydenberg that he was living with during the pandemic at the Lodge, hey, I think I should swear myself in as Treasurer to deal with some of these unilateral decisions that you're able to make as Treasurer, that it would be misunderstood by Josh Frydenberg, that somehow it suggested that might make his ministers insecure, and he didn't want them to feel that way. That doesn't sound to me like a very transparent way to operate a government, a cabinet-style government. So I found that extremely extraordinary, that admission. It also demonstrates that for him to be able to recall that level of detail, and to know that he'd sworn himself into departments that Andrew Probyn rightly says were ones that could make unilateral decisions that didn't go back to the Cabinet, right? Things like being able to hand a visa to a family like the Biloela family. He didn't mention that, but those sorts of powers, or the administrative tools of a Treasurer, that he essentially was collecting emergency powers for himself that he says he didn't seek to use, but he had armed himself with, because he says no one understands what it was like to be Prime Minister during this time. That was at the heart of his argument, Ros, that no one understood the shoes he was walking in. There was all this pressure on him. The media was mounting all this pressure on him, and that the way he sought to resolve that pressure was to arm himself with emergency powers.
And we heard from him, he said that he had a, quote, happy conversation with the former Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, about what happened. Very different situation with Karen Andrews. Of course, she is robustly calling for for him to step down, Andrew?
Well, he's not going to be stepping down, although he's not leaving his future in too much doubt. It looks like he is going to be retiring before the next election. There's been broad expectation that he would resign before Christmas. But going back on what we've just heard, he talked about not wanting to tell ministers that he was actually a co-signatory to their responsibilities because he didn't want to undermine their confidence. Now, that is quite remarkable, because if you don't have confidence effectively in the administration of a portfolio, what would you do normally? You would sack them. With Keith Pitt, it was quite clear that the Prime Minister believed that Keith Pitt, as Resources Minister, was going to give the OK to the PEP 11 project. He decided he was going to step in, make that decision himself. The way he talked about Josh Frydenberg expressing great fealty with his great mate, the former Treasurer. It's like expressing great love for your wife while bugging her phone. Some of the things that we've heard today from Scott Morrison don't pass muster, and you can imagine why his colleagues are going to be and continue to be furious.
So the story has galloped along during the course of the week. We've now heard from Scott Morrison himself defending his actions. Where does it go from here, PK? What do you see?
Well, what's interesting, as I know from the messages I'm getting, but I also know that what he's actually done, and I bet Andrew will agree with me here, is he's actually poured more fuel onto the fire. He's been defiant, he's been defensive. I thought it was an extraordinary performance. It wasn't an apology. Yesterday, the language that was being used is that he'd apologised to his ministers. There was absolutely no contrition here from the former Prime Minister. He basically has backed in his decision-making and explained his own personal angst as Prime Minister, and really what he's tried to do is shine a light on what he thinks was a deficiency in the system during this extraordinary time where he needed these emergency powers. Where's this going to go? Well, I actually think it will galvanise more anger towards him inside the Liberal Party, because he has been so defensive and has really not read the room on this one. So we are still waiting for this legal advice, Ros, that is to come on Monday next week from the Solicitor General. A couple of things that emerged in this press conference. He wouldn't reveal anything about his discussions with the Governor-General, and it got pretty testy, his exchange on what that legal advice was, and he was very defensive about that. So that will continue to lead to calls for the Governor-General and for this legal advice and the instruments to be revealed. So he wouldn't explain any of that. He also, I think he's really confused some issues again in relation to the way he needed the power for the Keith Pitt issue, for Resources Minister, and the time frame for all of these decisions. There's a lot of confusion around this. So more questions than answers again as a result of his public statement. He was very angry, and I think one comment I do want to make was also in relation to his family. He was very, very defensive about cameras outside his family home. He said he wants to be a quiet Australian. He urged the media, who he appears to be quite angry with, to leave Jenny and the children alone. I think probably a lot of people would be sympathetic broadly with the idea that people's children, politicians' children and their wives, shouldn't be brought into these kinds of things. But Scott Morrison's appeal, he began with it and he ended with it, was for people to essentially leave his family alone. But that doesn't mean that he will not continue to be dogged with questions on why he made these decisions and why he could say yesterday he didn't recall something when today he could not only recall it, but actually explain the methodology or the reasoning behind why he thought he should keep this information away from his ministers.
All right, we have to leave it there. Unfortunately, Patricia and Andrew, thank you both for your analysis of that media conference from Scott Morrison. Thank you.